So I'm Rob Esker. I started the OpenStack effort at NetApp 5.5+ years, something to that effect. Within a couple of months of the inception of the OpenStack project, I spent all my time on product management and strategy. Along the way, I've operated in a number of different capacities, a little bit of development, architecture, some deployment. But for quite a while now, more on the product management and strategy side of things. Within the community, myself and Ben Schwartzlander are co-founders of the Manila project. In the last couple of years, I've sat on the OpenStack Foundation board of directors as well. So I don't have a scripted set of slides. I have a number of things that I want to use for depiction purposes, and very much hopeful for interactive discourse and take it in the direction that would be most useful to you. But just to start with, as Mark Bregman, our CTO, had indicated, I think he had alluded to this, we are now, all of a sudden, we find ourselves a portfolio company. Classically, folks would think of NetApp as, those guys that built the filers, a single platform that was synonymous with NetApp. But progressively, we've layered in a number of other platforms, and my intention isn't to go through and describe those in depth here, but E-Series for more of a for high throughput, very dense sort of applications, less of the data management sort of intelligence, left more to the application. Storage, grid, web scale, it's full stack object storage server. You could think of it in the OpenStack sense as Swift++. In fact, it can be an alternative Swift endpoint. You have AltaVault, which was an acquisition, basically a cloud appliance, storage appliance. It functions as a target for classic backup software. It compresses, encrypts, it essentially shards and stores data as objects in things like S3 and things like Swift, and indeed is integrated with the Cinder backup service. But significantly, most significantly, and the thing I think we're most excited about is, of course, SolidFire. So I'll share kind of I think, sort of humorous anecdote. Some of the room might be familiar that NetApp had gone down the path of trying to build a native all-flash array. And that was a product that was to be named FlashArray. It actually sort of been pre-announced. We were concerned enough amongst the OpenStack, in particular Cinder landscape competitively with SolidFire that we'd attempted to sort of position to FlashArray. That was their target. That was their bar. We even built a FlashArray Cinder driver. I can even actually show you the commit that we abandoned, or rather the submission we abandoned. So we did one better by, of course, acquiring SolidFire. And that problem was solved, so to speak. Oh, I guess I hadn't actually advanced my slides. My apologies. So ONTAP is really where we started. And of course, this is the storage operating system that powers that file I was referring to, but now also available in a software form. So available in the form of Cloud ONTAP and places like AWS, but that will expand over time. So we started with that as the basis. The major thrust in starting into the OpenStack I guess you could say sort of market, it wasn't necessarily a market at that stage, was to make sure the distinguishing qualities of NetApp's platforms could be realized by either the deployer or the tenant. And so that meant going upstream. That meant like trying to alter the construct or influencing the construct. So for example, if things like storage efficiency technologies, perhaps it's deduplication or compression or whatever. There's many different sort of nuanced capabilities that storage platforms bring to the table. Cinder, as a abstraction, was abstract. Didn't necessarily understand those capabilities, and so it was important for us to become engaged with the community and help Cinder sort of develop this notion of that, and thus the distinguishing qualities of NetApp's platforms could then be realized. The value of it could then be realized by those who would go to deploy it. That was the major thrust, and that's been true across all of the platforms. I would venture to say that's probably true of SolidFire as well. I think there's some additional things I'd like to focus on there. And John Griffith, I just want to point out, is here in the room. Unfortunately, we don't have a mic at the moment, but John is the actual founder of the Cinder project. He was the project technical lead for many years, was on the OpenStack technical committee. So he'll keep me honest, hopefully. But both between his expertise there and SolidFire, there's some qualities of that platform I want to really point out is interesting insofar as OpenStack goes. So the epic of the company was 2010. it more or less grew up in line with OpenStack growing up. It was born at a stage when, you know, the era of cloud, if you will, was already upon us. And I would contend that's really very much part of the design center. So you get interesting autonomous capabilities, like for auto scaling. You know, it's simple day one, but it's even simpler yet. The real advantages of it are ongoing day 2, 3, and 4 in terms of its autonomous capabilities to, like I said, scale out. And it doesn't necessarily have the thick management model you might assume with other you know, classic sort of storage platforms. That, moreover, and as I understand this, John, really it was solid state mostly at the outset because deterministic I/O, because of QoS, because I need to make sure that, you know, when you're aggressively commingling as you do in a cloud context, that there is separation, that I can guarantee the thing that we contractually signed up for in terms of a quality service policy. So it's some really interesting advantages in terms of having grown up in this era and built and sort of organically sort of evolved in response to things like, you know, the questions that an OpenStack posits. So I'm not going to go too much more depth on this unless you have specific questions. But NetApp is all of a sudden a portfolio company, and probably the most evident example of where we're attacking it from a portfolio perspective is with OpenStack. It's probably the most comprehensive sort of portfolio enablement story we have. Of course, that's important as you know, OpenStack is starting to grow significantly. Our effort is not just, I'll move past this quickly. We have expressed you know, leadership in a variety of different ways, both in the board and project technical leadership, technical committee membership. We've been there since the beginning. We're the first to kind of go upstream. So what I wanted to point out, though, is that it's also evident in terms of our overall contribution to 2 out of the 3 most significant foundational storage services in OpenStack, namely Cinder and Manila. I guess I should probably, well, I'll get into Manila in just a second, but probably not strictly on the basis of John, but very significantly on the basis of John's contributions in evolving Cinder in the first place, breaking it out from Nova. We are the single largest single entity in terms of contribution over time to the Cinder project. In the form of Manila, this is actually a gap that we saw. And if you kind of accept that, you know, NetApp was a leader in the shared file system space, and still is, and there wasn't really treatment for shared or distributed file systems as a service within OpenStack. And I guess that kind of starts with OpenStack sort of being built, and I know this can be a little bit of a contentious topic, built in the image of AWS. There really wasn't commensurate, or there wasn't really sort of a treatment for shared file system service at that stage. Now, subsequently that's occurred. EFS is now, you know, available from Amazon. And this is actually kind of an interesting scenario. Manila beat EFS. It's kind of the first example of a capability within OpenStack actually beating Amazon to market. Hopefully more of that to come, but we'll see. Just to answer your question before it becomes one, we do engineering outsource with Marantis to expand our overall effort. So, you know, the combined contribution is even more significant. One thing I do want to point out Manila briefly, it's really a more nascent capability. We've only just now kind of declared it production ready as of the Liberty release. Of course, we're now with Mintaka. So it's starting to show up in distributions, both in like a production fully supported capacity and in others in a tech preview. If you look at the most recent OpenStack Foundation user survey results, they'll tell you it's like, I think the 2nd or 3rd most interesting new project that are being evaluated beyond kind of the core of it. The other thing is if you look at Cinder, the combined NetApp and SolidFire is the most widely deployed backend. There's a couple things at play here. I should also mention that we know anecdotally that a portion of LVM and a portion of NFS are also our systems. There's a couple of distributions that don't use the NetApp or SolidFire. I'm not sure if this is true of SolidFire, but definitely NetApp specific drivers. They'll use the generic driver. And certainly there are much of E-Series systems deployed under LVM. Not claiming the entirety of that by any means, but we know there's a slice of that. Ceph, I will point out, is an interesting one. I think that the Ceph community and certainly folks like Red Hat, prior to that, Inktank have done a great job of making it essentially synonymous with OpenStack. So, in fact, it's not uncommon that I have a conversation where folks are talking about Ceph, the OpenStack project, and of course it actually isn't. Ceph has a lot of promise. I think if I were in the deployer's shoes, I'd probably be kicking the tires really myself. You know, it would probably be remiss to not do so. What we've experienced, however, is that Ceph, and apologies to those, I guess it depends on what the flavor in the room is, but you know, everyone probably is familiar with the Gartner hype cycle of innovation. You know, peak of expectations followed by trough of disillusionment, slow ramp to productive use. People are in different places on that Ceph sort of timeline. There are a lot of folks that believe it to be, you know, all things possible, and it isn't. You know, it has finite boundaries, and of course, the folks that are using it productively have kind of come through that process. And so we've benefited along the way, where Ceph is initially deployed, sort of believed to be synonymous with OpenStack. And when it comes time to support production SLAs or support a certain type of workload, they'll layer in SolidFire or other components in NetApp's portfolio, sometimes additively to Ceph at a different sort of tier, and sometimes, you know, replacing it outright. So I guess the way we think about Ceph is it exists, it has promise, and we're even looking a little bit at what it would mean to provide some of the capabilities Mark alluded to, maybe even a top or below something like Ceph. But for the moment, I think deployers of OpenStack benefit from traveling the Ceph path a little bit and then, you know, layering in capabilities that exceed what Ceph can actually do. Another metric, and I have intentionally obscured, although I guess in certain light you might be able to see certain numbers. I probably shouldn't have pointed that out. These are from telemetry on our ONTAP system. So we have a phone home capability, auto support, if you're familiar with it, that we've hinted our Cinder drivers such that it, you know, and by the way, this is optional. You can turn this off if you don't want to let us know. We use this primarily for support purposes, but we can also get kind of interesting insights. Over the last year, and these are all, even the smallest bar is measured in 3 digits, our active production deployment in terms of unique customers, the lower bars, and then unique systems. So there's pretty decent ramp. I think some of the scale kind of is misleading. It seems to suggest, oh, well, there's not really a lot of growth in unique customers. Actually, pretty significant by percentage growth. But even more significant is that the ratio of systems to unique customers is growing quite a lot, which means we're now entering into the phase of productive use, and I need capacity. I need X2 and X3 and X4. It starts to show up as OpenStack's a real thing, and I'm not just, you know, POC in the corner kicking the tires type of activity. We don't have this telemetry from SolidFire, but in some ways, actually, the story is even more compelling because everything is net new. You know, this isn't just repurposing legacy estate or, you know, existing install base. This is something I expressly purchased and deployed because I needed it, and SolidFire was the choice I made.
So to look at this, you're looking at roughly, I can't see all the numbers here, but 2x over the last 12 months and accelerating.
I will look at the obscured numbers, and yes, 2x over in terms of deployed customers, and I can't see the obscured numbers for that. So, mea culpa, I guess, on that one. So, I can get you like percentage numbers, but specifics are probably not appropriate.
Honestly, I'm more interested in the discussion of the same thing that you mentioned, right? So, I mean, been in the community a while, as well as you, and started out as a small bunch of nerds doing a project, right? Yeah. And the suits have started to show up, and the output of the suits showing up as customers start using it at scale, eventually. Yeah. Yep. So.
It's funny. Some days I wear not suits, but button-up shirts. You know, so. I guess briefly, you know, I think maybe before I get into this, have you heard about I think in the past we talked about our data fabric vision. This is very much sort of aligned with that. You know, we want to build a data fabric. Mark earlier alluded to this. We see OpenStack, or at least a lot of promise insofar as OpenStack starts to proliferate, you know, as sort of a great unifying API. It helps solve for some of the problems when you do need to burst or repatriate across multiple endpoints, like what is your interface to the infrastructure as a service layer. So we're you know, hopeful that that actually does proliferate. We'll see, of course. But no, one of the things I wanted to point out is that our effort is not limited to OpenStack. It's very much the ecosystem around it that's emerging, and of course, if you've been paying attention to the summit sessions, it's I don't know what the number is, but a really significant number of them discuss OpenStack and containers, and we see different sort of schools of thought. Should containers be deployed as a service, a la Nova, or Ironic for Metal as a service, or maybe actually the right approach is to invert it and assume something like perhaps a Kubernetes as the basis and containerize the services themselves, solve also the complexity problems, the deployment day zero problem that OpenStack still suffers from to an extent. And just to be fair to the distributions, they're doing a lot of great work there, but work yet still in front of us. So regardless, we're have a huge amount of emphasis, and we've got folks like Andrew Sullivan here in the room who think big thoughts and put a lot of effort into it. John Griffith, who I think just in this last week was part of an effort to emit a Docker volume plugin, the NetApp Docker volume plugin, in fact, which is extensible and has support for the different platforms within our portfolio. In the broader sense, what we're really interested in is an attempt to standardize a nuanced access to differentiated storage capabilities and to establish a persistence model in the different container engines and container orchestration engine frameworks. Right now, it's still too much of the Wild West. There's so many different options. It's hard to figure out what's the one place to invest in to try and move this forward. So we're hopeful that, like for example, our participation in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation will be instrumental in actually moving that to more of kind of a standardization effort. We shall see. But we're also in discussion with a number of folks within the storage industry around potentially coalescing around a software-defined storage controller concept that would be as useful, if you will, to filling in some gaps around OpenStack as it is to solving for some of those problems I just mentioned amongst the different container framework contenders. So I've spit out quite a lot. I said I wouldn't bore you with slides, so let me shut up and make some room for some questions.
Can you expand on the software-defined storage controller concept that you're looking at?
So the key word is concept. We have a pretty strong idea of what we think it ought to look like. I guess just to frame it in OpenStack first. So Cinder, provisioning control plane, not in the data path, and this would not be in the data path either. That's not our intention. But there's some certain things that neither Cinder nor Manila really do. So if, for example, you're approaching resource exhaustion, perhaps volume type or share type, gold or silver or cats or dogs or birds or whatever is being exhausted, how do I actually go and attack the physical or address the physical resources at my disposal, discover them, and assemble the necessary things, compose gold, so that there's more of it to be had. And so this becomes particularly relevant when you think about maybe a fleet of software-defined ONTAPs, data on clustered ONTAP in a VM. It's interesting. It actually kind of underscores a particularly attractive attribute of SolidFire in that some of that is just handled autonomously in the platform. It's inherent to the capabilities of SolidFire. But there still becomes a point where you hit that high watermark. And there's a lot of different ways to measure what that is, where you need building block X2 and X3 and X4. And so what's the automation engine to go out and address, again, those physical resources to compose new storage controller entities with the desired attributes to address the potential for exhaustion, but on the inverse, also to contract it, to cull it as necessary, because it would be unnecessary to leave those spun up. But there's more to it than that. It's also about abstracting the nuanced capabilities of storage to the things that application developers care about. So I don't think I'm pretty sure application developers don't want to specify rotational media speed, and different attributes of hardware profiles. What I want, generally speaking, is a certain quality, performance, throughput, or latency, and a QoS value. And there might be more to it in terms of protection, but for regulatory purposes. But most of the time, you do want the abstracted thing. You don't want to know how. It's one of the things that NetApp and I'm sure others in the storage industry contend with, in particular at OpenStack, is that it is designed and deployed by cloud architects, not storage admins. They're not storage admins. They don't want to be storage admins. Their mentality is programmable infra. How can we give them the power of programmable infra that makes intelligent decisions without them having to know it? There's more to that, but let me shut up for a second. Does that make sense? So the concept is under discussion as we speak in some of the design summit sessions. So there's not appropriate to mention the other folks within the industry at this stage, but there is backroom discussions, if you will, around what it would look like and could we agree to come together. Is OpenStack the place? Is CNCF the place? Is a separate effort entirely? I think there's probably not as much support for that. But how do we do something that could appeal to both simultaneously? So TBD. We'll see if we can come together sufficiently to actually begin this. But I'm enthusiastic. This is the furthest that we've seen. The kinds of people that you would normally consider each other mortal enemies. Talking about operating in the open together.
Have you thought about how you could take Element X and bring it to the community, more like what EMC's done with Scale.io?
So I should probably first start by saying I have a basic degree of understanding of Element X and its behavior, but I am not the expert that John is. So if he may want to comment on this incorrect, but it is already true that Element OS in the form of Element X is something that in select instances we have deployed, qualified, and support deployment on commodity x86 hardware. And that's something that we've, I think, done carefully to ensure that it's the right experience. As far as expansion of that, I guess unless you have something in the way of breaking news, probably we would defer to maybe a future product announcement. Were we to make one.
Yeah. The key with Element X right now really is more along the lines of control. So from the startup perspective and everything else, we were very careful about making sure that we didn't get out in front of our skis, right? If you just immediately go out the door with a software only and say anybody can run it, any platform, anytime, anywhere, before we're actually comfortable and feel like we're ready, it's a recipe for disaster, right? If we had started out with that model, it would be a different story, but that wasn't where we started. I think over time, that's probably where we'll be heading, for sure. I can't make any promises or anything like that. I'm just an engineer, right? But I would say that we do have customers now that do run that model, and it works really well for them. The key for us is you have to be at a certain scale and a certain level of expertise and automation and stuff like that, that we take the training wheels off and say go.
Yeah, and in my head, I guess the question that I have is if you took that project and made it accessible for open source and turned it into people could collaborate and contribute, and what would that product then turn into? What could it turn into?
Yeah.
As a potential, right? And it's more of like a big thought process. I did brainstorm idea, but
yeah, it's kind of an interesting idea. Open sourcing it and flipping it, right? And I'm kind of mixed on. I'm a huge open source guy. I mean, that's all I do is open source. And even when I look at that model, I'm a little bit mixed on that. I'm not necessarily sure there's a ton of value in doing that, as opposed to, say, taking some of the internal technologies that we have and stuff like that and baking it into something else that's already out there. And the reason I say that is because the way code is written in an open source community, in an open source world, is significantly different than how that code actually exists inside some product.
Yeah, and I guess I'm not necessarily saying that it would be a deliverable appliance, but maybe a publicized method of how to get components working in a OpenStack supported, documented.
That's my goal. That's my goal and my dream. Whether I can get approval and pull it off, that's another story. But that's what I'd love to see, for sure.
Thanks. I don't know, perhaps worthwhile having a follow-up discussion later, offline. Any other questions? Anything for either John or I? Or by the way, Andrew Sullivan, from our containers team. What's missing? I mean, what do you think NetApp should be doing that you don't see us doing?
I haven't seen very much in the. I haven't seen very much acceleration in the object end from NetApp, especially around the open side of things. And when I say that is like if you have to stand up, I'm gonna pick on SolidFire. SolidFire, I need file at some level to start moving forward with OpenStack. Mm-hmm. And so then, what am I putting that on? Am I putting that on what a file server that I'm building inside of Linux, GFS? What does that look like when you do own or have purchased a portfolio company that does those objects? Yeah.
So apologies, hadn't really concentrated on that. Just briefly, you mentioned file, which I would distinguish as another topic beyond object. For file, I think for small scale requirements, there's probably some precedent for folks standing up like a Linux NFS server with the underpinning capacity delivered by SolidFire. I don't think that's like our NetApp recommendation generally. I think you're much better served by using ONTAP. And by the way, here's an interesting potential future state. What if you had S. underpinned by SolidFire capacity with the QoS of supplied by it? That's kind of a potentially compelling option, I think. But
the reason I kind of bring it up is because SolidFire lets you do some interesting things with S3.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so I was about to get to object.
Where object comes in as well. So.
Okay. So there's a few. I'm gonna, I guess, frame it in terms of OpenStack. So a few different things that we've done. So first of all, it is the case that the Element OS platform has the ability to actually do incremental backups to S3 and Swift.
S3 compatible.
And there's work, I guess TBD, so no announcements, not all together dissimilar elsewhere in the portfolio. I'll just leave it at that. But insofar as it applies to Swift itself, the upstream bits, we've done reference architecture. It's documented out in the open that relies upon some of the in-frame erasure coding-like capabilities of our E-series system. So there's a parity scheme called dynamic disk pools, which is kind of a distributed or deconstructed rate, if you will. That means that you can now use parity in an object storage deployment scenario, which otherwise you wouldn't, because the rebuild times are way too onerous, and kind of reduce rep count at that single site. So it's basically the upstream Swift bits on our E-series kit, but with reduced sort of physical hardware necessary to deploy. And now you're still going to need that second copy to account for network partition or site failure or whatever. So that's kind of like for the requirements that Swift itself is appropriate for. And for I guess higher order capabilities, storage grid web scale is now a alternative Swift API endpoint. Indeed, you could even, and I'm not saying this would be the common case, you could actually deploy, and we provided automation to, heat automation to actually deploy storage grid web scale within, as a tenant, in the tenant context, in OpenStack. And so, this is going to give you additional capabilities in creating kind of more of a geodispersed namespace. It does, have some sort of a hierarchical, well, I hate to use the term, hierarchical storage management-like qualities. I know that comes with its own set of sort of connotations. It grew up in the healthcare industry, so it kind of starts from the assumption of terse regulatory adherence assumed. So I guess you can kind of think of it as like sort of the enterprise object store, albeit with OpenStack interfaces to it. So that's kind of the basic approach there. It does derive, it's actually deployed at this point in part on containers. So we derive from the open source in those products. Storage Grid Web Scale itself is not open, to be clear. And that's something that I guess is a discussion to be had, but no announcements around that.